You're listening to a social justice podcast hosted by Nicola Spurling, brought to you by the Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling. Today we're talking about war, and my guest is Michael Kluckner. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nicola.
Can you briefly introduce yourself?
I am an artist who generally does book illustration, graphic novels, but I've also illustrated a number of quite formal history books, some of them on Vancouver, some Canada, Toronto, and elsewhere.
Wonderful. Well, this is exactly why I reached out to you, because it sounds like you're going to have a great deal of knowledge on this subject. And for the purpose of this episode, we're going to be primarily focusing on the social repercussions of war in Vancouver, on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which is where this podcast is recorded. That's why we're focusing on Vancouver. But with that in mind, we're not going to be focusing so much on the sort of destruction of buildings, of infrastructure, or the destruction of social services. Those are huge social impacts of war, but not so much felt here in Vancouver. So I just want to preface that before we begin. And I think your work has intersected with the topic of war quite often throughout your career. Is that correct to say?
Well, yeah, I think inevitably. You're dealing with this, whether it's something to do with the Japanese-Canadian internment during the Second World War, or you find some place and it turns out it was a shipyard site and the shipbuilding was the main activity in wartime for this. So, there are a myriad of these, or, you go into, you walk along Spanish Banks Beach and you keep going and you come upon an old gun tower that's out on the beach there. So somebody was intending to defend this from someone at some time. So there are all these sort of things that are still on the landscape.
Right. And can you briefly explain some of the work that you do with the Vancouver Historical Society?
Vancouver Historical Society is it's exactly what it says it is. It's a group of people, volunteer group of people, been around since the 1930s. And we put on 8 lectures a year on a whole range of topics. I mean, everything from gay Vancouver in the 1970s to how bicycle accidents were recorded through all the history. Just depending on who's out there, depending on what the topics are and how we feel that they will go. These lectures are presented on the 4th Thursday of the month at the Museum of Vancouver. They're free and open to the public. And they're also recorded and they're put up on our YouTube channel.
Oh, wow.
And so we have a record of lectures going back to 2016 of just about everything that's been presented to us for that. So it's really quite the archive and a dizzying array of presenters and topics. So, we're not wedded to any particular narrative of Vancouver history, Vancouver just being the name of the place where it takes place.
Right. Absolutely. That's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. And generally, when we're starting these episodes, we talk about what is the subject. And I think that may not be necessary in this case. What is war? War is an intense armed conflict. But before we begin to focus on the impacts of war in Vancouver specifically, I wonder if you're able to touch on what societal impacts war has, just generally speaking.
Total tragedy and disruption. For some people, it's an economic boom time. For other people, it's, your child, typically in the past, your son doesn't come home. In other cases, it brings out absolutely the worst in people in terms of prejudice. So it's got this range of things. It heightens emotion to the point of, it also tends to draw people together. I should say a majority of people who are in the country, it tends to kind of draw them together. And so people look back on it one way or another as being a very special time. The thing that Vancouver is very fortunate in is that, hasn't been invaded. I should say, if I were an Indigenous person, I would say no, it was invaded way back. But we're talking about Vancouver as a kind of a colonial construct, as a kind of a Western city, I guess. It hasn't been invaded, but it did have this tremendous disruption in it. And then if you also look at a consequence of, for example, the First World War, it wraps up with the Spanish flu coming in, as the Spanish influenza is coming on as a pandemic, just at the point that the war is winding down. And so, as if there hadn't been enough suffering of individual people, you get a tremendous loss of life. In the city, all over the world, really. Just it makes COVID just look like almost nothing by comparison. Yeah. And so people, I suppose people get almost immune to suffering for a while, and then as it comes out, often there will be an economic depression at the end of the war. And then that will be followed by an economic boom. And so it's that sort of situation. And that's repeated itself through Vancouver history. And there was one more war that we weren't directly involved in, the Vietnam War, but it had a tremendous impact here because of the number of war resistors who came here in the 1960s and the 1970s.
Right. And you touched on this briefly before about how it's mostly sons that were lost historically in wars. Can you maybe talk about what the experiences would be like from the perspective of women during the war as opposed to the perspective from men during the war or during a war?
There would be the separation. There would be the sense of loss. There would be the need to, let's put it this way, single parent. Young families. Men went off to war. Women were left here with their children. There were also, in particular, you think of the Second World War, there were tremendous economic and work opportunities for women that hadn't been around before that. Partly because 1930s period of the Great Depression, there wasn't really work for almost anybody, but women entered the industrial workforce in the Second World War, particularly, and then all of the advances that they had made and all of the kind of economic freedom that had given them was effectively taken away at the end of the war because the men came home, the men needed jobs. That was the way that the society worked at that point. And so women then retreated from that position of economic power and a lot of freedom and then went into the late 40s and the 1950s, which historically is a period of women really being in roles as wives, as mothers, as not a whole lot else. I mean, the world that I grew up in the 1950s, 1960s was like that.
Right. I wanted to move on now to some questions around basically going through the different wars that have occurred, that Canada's been involved in over the years, starting with, I believe World War I would be the first war since Vancouver's foundation. Is that correct? Yeah,
you could say the Boer War, but there was really no organized group that went from the Vancouver area, and that was in South Africa. It was a colonial war of actually two effective colonial nations fighting over that. What the Boer War tended to do was heighten patriotism here, patriotism being the love of the mother country, the United Kingdom, at that point. But the First World War saw this enormous patriotic sense of defending England, particularly because they figured that if Germany wasn't stopped in France, that it was going to be England, Britain, that was going to be invaded. And so there was recruitment of people from, as they say, from all walks of life. If I say even the Japanese immigrants who had come here at that point, who were refused the opportunity to enlist in Vancouver in British Columbia, they went to Alberta and they were able to enlist in the regiment there. And there's a very beautiful and rather touching war memorial in Stanley Park that people might know of the Japanese Canadian community and the sacrifices that were made there. So you had the local regiments, Duke of Connaught's Own Rifles, now known as the BC Regiment, and a number of other regiments that formed out of here, and large number, thousands of young men went initially to training camps in Eastern Canada, and then overseas, and then onto the Western Front, where they behaved absolutely heroically. And they would talk about the Canadian troops being, in effect, the most effective shock troops of the First World War. It just sounds absolutely ghastly, but Vimy Ridge being a classic battle in which the Canadians won the day. And so coming out of all this is this sense of intense patriotism, and it's patriotism for Canada. Canada is beginning, by the time of the First World War, to, I guess you would say, peek out from underneath the British flag and say, we want our independence. We don't want to be so dependent on Britain. Also, that reflects immigrants coming here from all over the world, and particularly a desire to trade more with the United States. And so Canada declares war in August of 1914, right at the very beginning of that. The United States stays out of it until April of 1917. And then they come in just at this critical point where it's been a stalemate, and they're able to tip the balance and feel very proud and righteous of themselves over that. There was a map in the Vancouver City Archives I remember seeing at one point where somebody had plotted all of the deaths of servicemen in it. And it was just this forest of little dots. You couldn't particularly say that one was on one side, that there was one area of the city that had more than other. They were quite spread around quite evenly, and so these are all the casualties. And of course, people came back maimed, they came back gassed, they came back shell-shocked, which we would now say PTSD. Mm-hmm. They came back, some of them came back effectively blinded from the chlorine gas and mustard gas that the Germans were using on the Western Front. So it was a very, very difficult time. And then they came back into a period where, coming back in 1918, I mentioned the Spanish flu. Mm-hmm. There was also a sudden collapse in economic activity as the shipyards closed down. And so,
sort of like a double whammy. Then you get the Spanish flu, you get the reduction of work, I suppose.
Reduction of work. And so it became a period just like, while the war was still going on, of tremendous labor activism. So, the BC electric streetcar system went on strike. There were strikes at the docks and so on, and a real militancy. This was a period of Russian Revolution had just happened in the previous year, and so you had all this kind of ferment happening, and of course made worse by the fact that there weren't good jobs for people to come back to. And generally, this is a total generalization, but if people have well-paid jobs, then generally they are kind of contented in their lives. And you compare that with our current situation where so many people, well, maybe they've got jobs, but the jobs are not paying them what they need to live. And so you're getting more and more unrest happening here. And that was the case at the end of the First World War. As the economic depression that happened here, 1919, 1920, 1921, got going, of course, with that conflict in society, then it brings up some of the old racist beliefs of people, particularly anti-Asian racism at that point. And so you get a whole slew of provincial legislation that is effectively anti-Asian, anti-Chinese particularly. And this kind of ferment continues through until about the mid-1920s, by which time prosperity has returned and everybody settles down, more or less.
Right, the Roaring 20s.
Yeah, and, the 20s didn't really roar here the way that they sort of did, maybe more in a place like Toronto, certainly more in the United States. Mm-hmm. But there was a period of significant prosperity here in the 1920s, and that, of course, comes to a crashing halt in 1929 with the Great Depression. So,
right.
And people are on the roads and people are homeless and so on. But that's not war. That's just sort of social history.
Right. And I think that's an important thing to bring up, because we're talking about the societal impact that war can have, and it seems like in at least some ways it's related. Some of it might have to do with the influenza. Mm-hmm. There may be these natural ebbs and flows of economic growth and was there a lot of anti-war sentiment at any point during this time? The idea that, well, our lives are really difficult, I suppose in the Great Depression or during the influenza pandemic, where people were just saying that this war wasn't worth it. Why did we do this?
Well, I suppose there was, but if you look at Vancouver around 1920, the vast majority of the population probably had origins in the British Isles. There were Italians, there were some Germans, yes, who kept their heads down. There were, 5 or 10% of Chinese Canadians, similar Japanese Canadians, and then of course Indigenous people. Some of whom had volunteered and managed to sign up and serve in regiments and everything, and then they got back to Canada, found they had no rights. So, there's all this kind of bubbling away underneath the surface. I think the broader social and social justice issues were capitalism versus socialism in the broadest sense, and that certainly is a significant part of Vancouver history around that time, and then coming back again very, very strongly in the 1930s. But you come through, and then Second World War is declared in 1939 when Germany invades Poland, and all of the Allies come together, and Canada, as an independent dominion at that point, actually declares war by itself. In a sense, it opts to come in right at the beginning. And you have that same very, very strong patriotic idea that comes forward. It gets rid of the uncertainty that was left over from the Depression, and still a kind of a difficult economy in the late 1930s. All of a sudden, common cause. Germans are invading our allies. God, it really got bad. People are signing up. They have this sense of their going forward together. It's the sort of thing that if you have to ask yourself, what would it take now in terms of environmental disaster or climate change disaster to pull people into a common cause like that, where they would all work together towards a solution? War certainly did that. And so Second World War gets underway, and it's a European war for 2 years until the Japanese. Well, let me just back up. I'll just back up a little bit. One of the interesting things about the 1930s is the Japanese Empire invades China, 1936, 1937, and you begin to see in Vancouver a sympathy for the Chinese people who are living here, for the Chinese Canadian people, even though they have, they've been subject to all kinds of racism. There's been effectively an exclusion act that's been underway, and a lot of people will be aware that we've just celebrated on July the 1st, 2023, the centenary of the Chinese Immigration Act that effectively banned all Chinese immigration into Canada. But by the 1930s, the Chinese Canadian people who are here are begin to be being looked at with some sympathy, because people can see this horrible aggression of the Japanese, and what's called the rape of Nanking, the city of Nanjing today, of just hundreds of thousands of civilians apparently killed at that time, and so the Chinese Canadian people here who are kind of marooned by this, and so they begin to be seen as being people with a kind of a common cause. Nevertheless, in that period, late 30s, well, there's no European war. The European war starts September 1939. And so there's this rallying again, and the Blitz of London and British cities in 1940. So that population, that kind of white Anglo population of Vancouver, really finds a common cause in that. So there's a lot of enlistment, and industry picks up, the shipyards are picking up, and all the rest of it.
Because that's quite a shift from World War I, where the Japanese were fighting with the Allies, right? And
that's exactly right.
Now it's being flipped on its head.
Yes, and I didn't mention that earlier, that Japan was actually an ally of Britain, and that was one of the reasons that, because Japan and Britain were allies, that the Canadian government never passed a kind of an exclusion immigration law against Japanese people at that time. And that was why you got such a strong, big, like 22,000 Japanese Canadian people here by the 1930s. And because both men and women were immigrating, and they were forming families, and they were having children, and so you had all that going on. So that was a very, very good point. And in fact, because the west coast of Canada in the First World War was so undefended, there was effectively all of the British ships had left for more of the war zone, that the Japanese Navy was said to be providing a little bit of defense against the German Navy. There were a couple of German cruisers that were prowling around the Pacific, and because of fears that there might be an attack by German cruisers coming into Vancouver Harbor, that there were gun emplacements put at Ferguson Point and Stanley Park during the First World War. December 7th, 1941, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president, said, "A day that will live in infamy," the Japanese Navy, Japanese Armed Forces attacked Pearl Harbor, the American naval base in Hawaii. And all of a sudden, the war that had been a European war became a world war. And this gave an opportunity, a necessity, effectively, for some further defense emplacements to be made in the Vancouver area. And so on the beach out near Point Grey, there's still a gun tower there, a gun emplacement, and a few other little buildings like that. And if you happen to go into the Museum of Anthropology, and there's a room in there where there's a very, very beautiful Bill Reed sculpture that is put in. It's actually put into a gun emplacement that was there. Oh, okay. And if you were a university student, UBC student in the 1950s and 1960s, and you were looking for housing, you might have found your housing at Fort Camp, which was this collection of shacks right out effectively on Point Grey. And that was left over from that period. All gone now, all demolished. But because Japan had entered the war against Britain, Canada, the United States, it gave the perfect opportunity for people here. I'm talking about the Town Planning Commission. I'm talking about a number of federal and provincial politicians who had been very anti-Asian, very anti-Japanese during the 1930s. It gave them the perfect opportunity to act. And so beginning in late winter of 1942, signs went up telling all people of Japanese ancestry, regardless of whether they were born here or not, telling them that they had to report to the RCMP, that they had to register, and then the administrative mechanism began to displace all these people from the coast. Initially, taking all their property, and this includes all the homes that they had and the homes they owned and the businesses and so on, but taking their property, and it was going to be held by the custodian of enemy alien property, and that included fish boats. Japanese ancestry people were very, very prominent in the fishing industry here, and so you had this emptying out of the Powell Street area in Vancouver, which had been, well, sometimes known as Little Tokyo, sometimes known as Japantown, but typically I think known as Powell Street. And then also Steveston in Richmond, which had a very strong Japanese community with the fish boats and the canneries and all of that. And so all of these people waited, not knowing exactly what was going to happen. And then the federal government, with cooperation of the provincial government, put in BC Securities Commission, and it rounded people up. Initially, it was all of the Japanese ancestry people, which the vast majority of them, about 22,000 of them, who lived within 100 miles of the coast. Mm-hmm. So that's a line, you think of about where Hope is, out the eastern end of the Fraser Valley, and then heading north from there. And because most of the Japanese people who had migrated here they were effectively maritime people. This big scoop of these people got nearly all of them, and they were put in, most of them into the Pacific National Exhibition, a lot of them into the Livestock Building and into the Forum. So the administrative machinery was put into place to create these internment camps up in the interior of British Columbia. So they're effectively jails, but they don't have barbed wire around them. It's an interesting contrast with the United States, where the United States government did the same thing. It displaced all of the Japanese American population off the coast, but it put them into 10 huge camps that were effectively like concentration camps out in the Eastern California, and then in the States, sort of east of the Rocky Mountains, and about 100,000 Japanese Americans went into these camps for the duration of the war. Our people here went into ghost towns up in the interior, so Sandon, Greenwood, New Denver. These were all places that had been built up during the mining boom of the early part of the 20th century. Then they were more or less abandoned as the minerals ran out. And so they were up there, and they made the best of it, effectively, made the best of a very, very difficult time. Lillooet is another place. The closest camp to Vancouver is Tashme. Tashme, just east of Hope on the Hope-Princeton Highway. I mean, you could do a day trip up there, and it's been beautifully interpreted in the last several years of the camp that went in there and how it was organized and so on. So an extremely difficult time for Japanese Canadians. And for the rest of the population, well, it was a boom time economically here for shipyard work. Extreme housing shortages in Vancouver. The people who had been living in houseboats and little squatter shacks all along the water, some of them were able to hang on until after the war. So Cole Harbor, where all of the super luxurious condos and the yachts are today, that was all houseboats of people who worked in the factories doing war work there. There was a small Boeing aircraft manufacturing plant there. There was another one at Vancouver Airport on Sea Island, and the little community of Burkeville. If you happen to find your way across the Arthur Lang Bridge and you get on to Sea Island there, and instead of going right to YVR, turning right and going to YVR, you turn to your left and you'll wind through this picturesque, funny little community that was all the war workers' communities of that period, and the Boeing plant that was where the South Airport is now. You know, all these stories of people packed into old rooming houses in the West End. When moving day came at the end of the month, people would move their possessions by wheelbarrow through the streets of the West End. Big fights in places like Shaughnessy Heights, where people were turning the old mansions into rooming houses, and then they were getting sued by some of the wealthy people there for violating the zoning and so on. So it's a real period of turmoil. And everywhere else, when you think of a kind of a rooming house landscape of people of my age, like I'm in my 70s, right? So I'm thinking back 1960s, 1970s, when I was young, and there were all of these rooming houses that were there, and these were places that had been converted during the Great Depression, converted during the Second World War for housing for people and for all of the workers who were here. And then, of course, the soldiers went overseas, generally into a time, 1940, 41, 1942, they were all bivouacked in southern England, primarily in southern England. There was the catastrophic Dieppe raid in 1942, where it was an attempt to sort of test the German defenses. Great loss of life, Canadian loss of life in that, because this was effectively the Canadian raid. The Canadians were chosen as they were going to be the ones that were going to do that. My mother was a military nurse in southern England, and she didn't talk very much about her time as a nurse, but she talked about all of the wounded coming back from Dieppe and just how they were absolutely frantic trying to save lives after that in 1942. And then a little bit later on in the war in 1943, the Canadians take a big part in the invasion of Sicily and then the drive up through Italy, going there. And then June 6th, 1944, D-Day. If you watch American media or you watch American movies or read American books, you would think that it was entirely the Americans who invaded France, but the Canadians did the beaches further north than the Americans did, and the British were in there too, in other beaches, and then the Canadian role was driving sort of east and then north and effectively liberating Holland. Belgium and Holland, and that, as the Americans and the British pushed east from that. So lots of casualties, lots of deaths, and the newspapers. You read the newspapers of that time, and you just think, my God, what it must have been like to be here. And you're getting these war reports and so on going on.
And I do want to touch on that point as well about how information is relayed, because as you point out, if you look to American media, it seems like they were the ones who ended the war essentially on their own. And I think the same thing applies when you look at media related to, for instance, Japanese internment camps.
Yes.
It's sort of glossed over. We like to think, at least the people who craft these narratives like to think that we were the saviors. We're going into Europe. We're taking out the bad guys. They did everything wrong. We're the good guys. But in reality, there were a lot of atrocities committed all around. And that's unfortunately the case with pretty much anything in history, is you're always going to find that there's these nuances. There's different atrocities being committed by people in all positions, whether they were sort of overarchingly in the right or not. And I just wanted to point that out when it comes to this, that a lot of our history is not necessarily subjective, like, what happened. It's factual, but it depends on who's relaying that history, how we're going to interpret it.
And the victors tell the tale.
Right, exactly.
And that was the case certainly with the way that history was presented in schools when I was a child. Indigenous history wasn't romanticized, and it wasn't glossed over. It was done quite respectfully, I think you would say. But it effectively said that there was this inevitable juggernaut of civilization, and I put that in quotes. Christian civilization would be another way of describing it, that was going to take over this land. The Americans, with their directness with language, had the term manifest destiny. And Canadians, being much more slippery with language, never really defined what would you call it, the colonial project, I suppose, at that time. This massive migration of people from Europe into Canada. I mean, the narratives are constantly being told and retold. Interesting, Italian people were, of course, the enemy. And during the Second World War, not during the First World War, but during the Second World War, they had very, very good leadership here that managed to keep most of the Italian people who were in Vancouver out of trouble with the police. There was not that kind of reaction as there was against German nationals who were here. And then same in the First World War, the German nationals, people going into prison camps. But there's a racial aspect of it that really hit the Japanese hard. Chinese people who were here, quite a number of Chinese people enlisted and became part of the army. There's been these very, very moving exhibitions at the Chinese Cultural Center, and now coming into the new Chinese Canadian Museum that's just opened, of the role that a lot of Chinese Canadian people played during the Second World War, particularly. And all of this, and it becomes part of the narrative of everybody finally shaking off much of their racism after the war is over. And 1947, immigration reopens of Chinese people into Canada. The restrictions begin to come off. So, sometimes it takes a war and everything going back, and people give their heads a shake and they say, this was absolutely crazy. The Japanese case, in the United States, they began to release Japanese American people from these prison camps, even before the end of the war, even before the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan in August of 1945. And these people, and as I understand it, that nearly all of the Japanese American people got their property back at the end of the war.
Oh, okay.
In Canada, nobody got their property back.
Right.
It had all been sold off. And I would invite listeners, viewers of this to look for a website called Landscapes of Injustice. I think it's landscapesofinjustice.ca. And this was a multi-year project involving all kinds of people from the Nikkei community and academics and so on, trying to get to the bottom of how the decisions were made to displace the Japanese, to sell off their property, and then how they couldn't get it back. And I mean, even in just to complete the thought about the way that the Canadian government treated the Japanese Canadian people, the wartime restrictions on their movement in Canada didn't come off until, believe it or not, April Fool's Day, 1949.
Oh.
So the war ended August 1945. And everybody else sort of began to go back to normal, but Japanese Canadian people could not return to the coast of British Columbia until the middle of 1949.
Wow.
Because of these restrictions. So it took that long for them to shake this stuff off. And again, I invite people to go to the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby to look at this, to look at the Landscapes of Injustice website, and to try to fit this into a broader narrative of people moving here, people being in control, people making laws, how these things went. Why, despite all this, was it attractive for people to emigrate from Japan? Mm-hmm. Why did they want to come here? Why did Chinese people want to come here, despite all of the racism and the prejudice? One more little comparable. Chinese immigration into the United States was banned, totally banned, from 1882 till 1943.
Wow.
So, you've got these broad narratives, and the wartime events are, to a degree, a kind of a blip in them. Mm-hmm. So history's really complicated, and you can't do the soundbite narrative of what happened. It's really important for people to try to figure out. Let's say you're a white person, and you imagine yourself being a working class white person, and you're from Scotland, say, and you've effectively been displaced off your land in Scotland because of the Enclosures Act. And so the only option that you have is working in some godforsaken factory in northern England. And the opportunity comes to move to North America. So you might go to the States, or you might come to Canada. And you're looking to improve yourself. You're looking to improve your life, but you're becoming part of a narrative that is displacing other people. Mm-hmm. So, it's really difficult if you imagine yourself back in that situation, and as you would say, imagine yourself now. You are wanting to make a better life. You're wanting to migrate to Canada and become part of Canadian society. But as you're doing that, you're becoming part of a longer-term narrative. I'm saying particularly about Indigenous people, mm-hmm. because it's about it's a narrative that unfortunately has an impact on other groups, such as Indigenous people, mm-hmm. and increasingly a stratified society. So you might be coming here to improve your life, but your act of doing that might displace that. So it's all this stuff. And wartime just, in a sense, kind of shortens the timeline on these things.
Right. Well, I find it's quite interesting and also disheartening that there seems to... Just wait a second. When you look into our history, you see so many examples of people discriminating against others based off of their ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you see that in the Vietnam War. People are afraid of certain ethnicities. Or you see that when it comes to the Cold War, that distrust of Russian people, or even these days, COVID hit. suddenly there's this rise of anti-Asian hate. And we talked about that in a recent podcast. So there's always these issues that they haven't gone away. But I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you know, but I was watching a documentary recently about World War II and Hitler's point of view, which was essentially looking to what America had done to displace indigenous people and said, I want to emulate that. I want to copy the techniques that they used to round up Jewish people and other minorities within Germany and the areas that Germany occupied. Is that a narrative that you're aware of? And if you are you able to touch on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the narratives that when you look at Nazi Germany and you look at what it was doing, and anti-Semitism didn't begin at the time of the American, I mean, the American displacement of indigenous people, the Manifest Destiny thing. It was just a continuation of a process of people shoving out other people. And Jews in Germany, Jews all over Europe had been under tremendous stress, being moved out of losing all their rights, of being effectively exiled out of countries, and this had been going on for hundreds of years, and going back to a Christian narrative, I suppose. Religion has never been the sort of thing that has brought people together, in my opinion. It's just added to the divisions of people.
As George Carlin would say, more people have been killed in the name of religion than for any other reason.
Yes, and I mean the whole Jewish situation is really quite interesting. I just finished doing a graphic novel. This is doing the art for a graphic novel comic book on the Bund, the Jewish Labor Socialist organization that was active in Ukraine, Russia, Poland, and late 19th, early 20th century. Couldn't have been more timely because Russia just invaded Ukraine, at the time that we were getting started on this. And then the splits within the Jewish community between the people who wanted to speak Hebrew and create a homeland in Israel, the Promised Land, and go there, which, by the way, was already occupied by other people, but so there's that narrative going on. The Bundists, the more secular Jews, socialist Jews, were part of that incredible diaspora that took place, and had a huge impact on culture of North America. In Canada, particularly Montreal and Toronto, but also in Vancouver a little bit. And then you think of New York City, you think of all of that sort of thing going on. The human capacity to abuse other people whom you can define as being different is just limitless.
Right.
And I could talk about my childhood and say that school in Westside Vancouver in 1950s, 1960s. A couple of Chinese Canadian kids in there, but there were so few of them that they weren't a problem, and so we all got along. Jewish kids, same. There weren't that many of them. Everybody got along. I don't remember any real overt discrimination about that, but you would find people who were looking for people to discriminate against or to criticize or whatever, and they say, "Oh, the Catholics." So you would get anti-Catholic stuff going on. And, because this was effectively a Protestant area, right. And, more or less a Protestant city, more or less people migrating here from the United Kingdom, mainly. Much different in Toronto, much different in Montreal, very, very different kind of a narrative. But it's that ability that people have to find reasons to dislike people, and so often it seems to come out of a situation where, well, you're a German in the 1930s, and there's this guy named Hitler, and he says, we need Lebensraum. We need room to expand. We need room to move. Oh, there are these ethnic these ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland. We'll invade the country next door. We'll just boot everybody out. along the way, we can find other people. Well, we've got these historical imagined grievances against Jewish people, so we do that. So, and so in a lot of cases, it creates just that kind of creeping racism that you would see in Canadian history or American history. God knows American history is much more complex, probably, you could say, than Canadian history on that because of slavery. But as people begin to fall behind other people and they become envious and they look around and they say, who can I blame? Or this guy who has no effectively citizenship rights or human rights, I think he's willing to work for less than I am, and therefore I hate him, and it's driving wages down. I mean, that was why so much of the anti-Asian discrimination going on here, kind of wartime stuff, and then going into the 1920s was, and even before that, even before the war, was based on primarily Chinese Canadian people, but also Japanese Canadian people being willing to work for less than white people.
We recently talked about that on our xenophobia podcast, where there's this assumption that newcomers are here to steal jobs, essentially. And that seems to be ongoing, whether it's Mexican people and typically in the southern U.S. or the you get a kind of a nativist response to immigration. I mean, it's tough. All this stuff is tough because you think of the majority of people being here and having a kind of a stake in a place, and then maybe losing it or having it chipped away at. So that would be Indigenous people, big time. It would be a white working class kid who dad was able to buy a little house or something like that, being a unionized sawmill worker, and then looks around now and there's just no way that they can get a toehold into society. So we've spent a fair amount of time talking about the world wars, but there's been some other wars that have happened that have affected Vancouver since then. There's the Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War, Cold War, Afghanistan War. Can you maybe talk about some of these wars and the societal impacts that they've had here in Vancouver? Yeah.
Korea, like a miniature version of World War II. There was no draft. There was no conscription here. People who wanted to went overseas. We didn't really talk about whether there was a draft here as opposed to the United States, which had compulsory conscription. But there wasn't any for the Korean War. You come forward into the Vietnam War, and Canada was in this position where it was one of three members on a United Nations commission that was set up to enforce the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, left over from colonial French, 1954, when the French were booted out of Vietnam, and the North went communist. Just following after China going communist in the late 1940s. So Canada is in this position of being part of a United Nations group, and so therefore can't really get involved with the Vietnam War as the Americans get ramped into it in the early 1960s in an anti-communist fight. Australia joins in with the United States in that. But we're just sitting up here north of the 49th parallel going, this is getting really bad here. And because there was the draft in the United States, and so you hit 18 down there, and unless you were able to work out some kind of an exemption for health reasons, or, maybe you were at a certain university and you could work that out, you were drafted into the Army or the Navy, and probably you would be sent to Vietnam. And increasingly the sense that this was an unjust war, that what was going on was effectively a military dictatorship in the south of Vietnam versus, I guess you could say, a communist dictatorship in the north part of Vietnam. And rather than getting involved with that, people were just saying, hell no, we won't go. We don't want to be part of that war. And so you had a flood of Americans, and predominantly, I would say, white and well-educated Americans who had had a kind of more of a liberal or left-leaning philosophy, perhaps more than working-class kids did, and certainly than African-American kids did, who didn't have quite the same options there. And so they come up here, possibly as many as 30,000 men, 40,000 men. It's really hard to get a sense of how many were. But interestingly, an equal, if not greater number of American women came here. In some cases, bringing their young children, their teenage boys coming up, and coming into Canada using what were very liberal immigration laws at that time to apply for landed immigrant status and becoming part of Canadian society. And it just had a huge impact here. It shifted Vancouver area particularly away from being this kind of backwater of the 1950s, early 1960s into being a more radical culture, brought the hippie culture, that had started here, but I mean, brought it and added to it here in the late 1960s. And there was also a sense of organizing that they had been much more a part of in the United States at that point, organizing against the Vietnam War, so coming up. And so you're getting a group of people finding common cause with Canadians and groups coming out of that, such as, well, Greenpeace would be one that would that came out of that whole anti-war movement of the time. And so it had a tremendous impact on the Vancouver area, and then also in other parts of the interior, particularly the Kootenays around Nelson. There were a lot of American war resistors who went into the Kootenays, and still very much that kind of hippie's a kind of a loaded word, but kind of countercultural community that went into there. And so that had a tremendous impact on Canada. You had all of these highly educated, left-leaning young people, men and women coming in. And if you go into areas of Vancouver today, Grandview is the one, Grandview where I live, a lot of my neighbors, a lot of my friends, they came here during the Vietnam era.
Right.
Men and women came here and made lives here, and they've made a huge impact on that. Quite a lot of Americans.
From the U.S.
They came from the U.S. They came from the U.S. during the Vietnam period, and there were quite a number of Americans who took the Carter amnesty, which I think was 1976, 1977, where they were able to go back into the United States, and if they had just been draft dodgers as opposed to deserters, and they were able to go back and escape prosecution, and a lot of people went back from there. But you find people, I mean, a good friend of mine who's in his mid-30s, his parents came here, war resistors in the Vietnam era. So, and he's got a lot of their kind of left-leaning values. So that had a huge impact. You're talking going forward a little bit into Gulf War and so on.
Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan.
Yes.
Starting to get a little bit more recent. I was actually surprised to find out that the war in Afghanistan went on for as long as the war in Vietnam.
Yes. I think from the point of view of Canada, it was far away. We weren't that involved. We had an entirely volunteer army. You know, people who wanted to be in the military went into the military, so it didn't have that sort of thing. And I mean, I think of Jean Chrétien, the prime minister at the time, and being asked in an interview what he thought his legacy was going to be, and he said it was the fact that we didn't go into Iraq. He refused to go into Iraq. Britain went in, as an example, but Afghanistan seemed. It seemed
more like you were fighting terrorism as opposed to seeking out oil.
Yeah,
or something
fighting terrorism, and I mean, as it's turned out, you're fighting for women's rights in a sense. You're fighting for probably a more secular society, if that would ever come out. Or that was what I think people believed that they were fighting for, against a theocracy, not having the impact. There were certainly Afghanis here, all kinds of Iranians who were here, Iraqis and so on, who would feel that in the same way that Ukrainian Canadians feel, that this direct connection with wars that are going on halfway around the world. But it never achieved that kind of critical mass that the earlier wars did. Korea, World War II, World War I, and I think that speaks also to there having been a more homogeneous population here.
It's also more of a fair fight as opposed to you're just sending tons of drones in to bomb places where you're not seeing as many casualties here at home.
Yeah, and I mean, the history of war and history of Britain's imperial wars. Of course, I mean, you could talk for days about that. I mean, there are all these other things about Canada and how all of this comes together. We don't have a climate here that could grow the plantation crops of the 18th century, 17th century. No sugar, no cotton. So probably for that reason and for that reason alone, there was not widespread slavery here compared with the United States. Very famously, some of the First Nations kept slaves on the West Coast. There were lots of cases of black people getting out of the United States on the Underground Railroad, and Africville in Halifax. There's a wartime story for you when the
Book of Negroes covers that pretty.
Yeah, when that munition ship blows up and it's in the harbor and the Africville is right down on the harbor where the cheap land is and everything where the black people were living, and so they suffered disproportionately from that one. No, I mean it's history is fascinating, and listeners and viewers, please look on YouTube, Vancouver Historical Society YouTube channel, and look at the range of, I mean, there are 50, 75 different talks that are up there over the last 7 or 8 years. And have a look at those, and some of them are going to be interesting, some of them not. Some of them, give you an introduction into things. Start coming to our lectures, kind of get involved with that. I don't think any of us who are involved, and I'm an amateur historian, amateur in the old Latin sense of being somebody who loves history. Okay, so I don't believe I've got the answers. I just keep, to a degree, finding more questions. And I think when you look at some of these issues, as we've talked about war being a case where in some ways it accelerates what's happening in the society with all of the stress. I wonder what's going to happen with climate change. Whether that will be the next war that will really rally people, because there's going to be massive displacement.
Yeah. I hear that a lot is if we want to take the climate crisis seriously, we need to treat it like a war. At this point in time, we're sort of getting to the end of the questions that I have for you about war. We're wanting to wrap things up fairly soon. But is there anything that you think is really important to touch on related to the societal impacts of war before we start to wrap things up?
Societal impact of war is displacement. Some people lose everything. Some people gain a lot. It's just a total shakedown. And not surprisingly, wealthy people do better than poor people at it. People of the dominant group in a society do better than the minorities in a society. It accelerates processes that are going along and very often leads to a situation where the human rights get just tossed onto the heap for the time being, where there are, well, in some countries, absolute atrocities taking place. In other cases, it's how would you describe it? I guess it's the loss of civil rights. It's the loss of people's sense of citizenship, of sense of belonging, and then societies rebuild themselves from that. If you look at the United States in the decade after the Vietnam War, how long it took for people to begin to settle down there. Not that it settled down for very long, but I mean a time of extraordinary personal sacrifice, and then also a time of coming together. And so you hear that trope, that cliche about the Second World War generation being the greatest generation. You hear that, and whether that's true or not, really arguably, but a lot of self-sacrifice in that, a lot of suffering, a lot of coming together, and interesting times. Peacetime is pretty fraught for a large part of our society now, so it's hard to know how war would change that. But I think climate change will show us what we're in for.
Right. And that's actually a good time to just remind our listeners that all of the topics we talk about on this podcast, they intersect with each other. We've talked about PTSD coming out of wars. We've touched on mental health and disabilities in two separate podcasts. We've talked about climate change in another podcast. So none of these issues are standalone. There's always these intersections that are really interesting. And as we bring this to a close, there's one last question that I want to ask you, which is what our listeners can do to help. So we have this question at the end of all of our podcasts. You've sort of touched on this already. Go to the Vancouver Historical Society YouTube, go and see some of those lectures, educate yourself on the subject. What else might our listeners do?
Join an environmental organization. Try to get involved with groups that say that you can have a successful life by having smaller material goals than might otherwise have been the case. Try to live a little bit lower on the food chain. Try to look around for people that you can help. Figure out some way that you can do an act of kindness. I mean, this sounds like kind of motherhood and apple pie cliches, and I don't really mean for it to sound gratuitous, but there is a lot that we can do. And a lot of the decisions that we make, I mean, everything about the way that we live, what our goals are, how we consume energy, all these sorts of things. The way we're going now, we're obviously creating more and more inequality, and a kind of an inequality that is staggering to me, somebody at my age, because it wasn't like this when I was a kid. Not to the same degree. We try to work towards a society that will be more equal in every respect, and when you're feeling a little bit down because something isn't going your way, don't look for somebody to blame. Certainly don't look for somebody poor, somebody of color to blame. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. I think that's a great place to leave it. And thank you so much for being a guest on today's podcast.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, it was
Thank you for inviting
really
me.
interesting to hear what you had to say. And this has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling. Today, I've been joined by Michael Kluckner for a discussion about war, and I'll see you in the next one. You've been listening to a social justice podcast hosted by Nicola Spurling, brought to you by The Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.